Then thunder started rumbling. Everyone looked at the sky as the dark clouds began to veil the crescent moon. Kadrid whispered to himself, "The moon of retribution. I should have guessed." "Let's get back upstairs," he said. Shawnee led the way up the stairs and Kadrid locked the bottom door. The kids sat on the floor by the bookshelves. Sid began hyperventilating and everyone began shaking uncontrollably. And then the real panic took over. "We gotta get out of here," screamed Tawny. She tried to get up and run, but Shawnee and Lisa grabbed her by the arms and brought her down to the floor. The boys grabbed them and everybody started screaming and began to panic. Kadrid quickly ran to the table and grabbed a couple of bottles and emptied the contents into his hand and ran towards the melee. He grabbed one of the lit candles and held it in front of him towards the hysterical teenagers. Then he held the candle in front of him and threw the different colored powders into the flame toward the teenagers. After it passed through the flame, it turned into a red mist and quickly enveloped the kids. Then they all fell silent and slowly slagged to the floor. Within a couple of minutes, the cloud faded, and then the old man looked at his watch for about 3 minutes. Then the kids all sat up quietly and looked around in a bit of a daze. As their minds cleared, Kadrid walked over to them. "I understand you're distraught, young ones, and I'm sorry for your friend, but he had met his fate. Now we have the living to worry about." The kids were still a bit dazed, but they all shook their heads in agreement. "Shawnee, my dear, there's a medical kit in the cabinet. You and Lisa and Tawny see to Sid. Willie, you come with me." Kadrid then went to a small cupboard and pulled an amulet out of the drawer. It was about 3 inches long and 4 inches wide, and it had a triquetra that was emblazoned in gold atop a 5-star pentagram hanging from a sterling silver train. He opened the door and hung it outside. He grabbed his scimitar. "Let's go, son," he told Willie. When they got to the bottom, Kadrid slowly looked around and headed for the phone across the room. "Are you calling the cops?" asked Willie. "No, son. Someone far more powerful." And when they answered the phone, Kadrid started talking in a kind of broken English. Willie could only understand some of what Kadrid was saying. After 5 minutes or so, he hung up the phone, and he looked at Willie with a troubled face and put his hand on his shoulder. "You need to tell me what happened in the shack, Willie." Willie looked at him, but still he was in a calm state, so he started to tell him how they thought Tommy was asleep and that Sid and David were getting paranoid and decided to chain Tommy to the chair. "Then what happened?" "Well, they got him chained and we thought he was still asleep. So we sat down, did a toast, and downed our beers. And then when we looked at him, his eyes were open. They were black and white, and he had an evil grin on his face. And then he said, 'You fellas having a good time?' Then without him moving an inch, one by one, the links in the chains began to burst and fly around the shack. We ran to the door, but when Sid opened it, it slammed closed, and we couldn't open it again. Some of the chains of broken links flew through the air and hit the door, and when we turned around, Tommy was standing there, smiling. The corners of his mouth stretched almost to his ears. 'Where are you going, my friends?' The party had just begun. With that, David grabbed the bat and stepped slowly towards him. Tommy didn't move a muscle. David asked him, "What are you?" Tommy replied, "Well, that might take a while to explain, and I'm afraid none of you had that kind of time." David lunged toward Tommy, but before he could finish his first step, Tommy's face was inches away from his, still smiling. "Well, David, it's been a hoot. Thanks for all the lovely memories. I'll cherish them literally for eternity." Then he grabbed David's shoulders and dug his fingers through the flesh, and you can hear the crack as he dislocated both of them. David dropped the bat. Tommy kicked it before it hit the floor, and it smashed Sid in the head, and he fell against the door. I froze. My eyes were fixed on Tommy. Then he picked up David by the ankles and lifted his legs in the air. "That's to you, my friend," Tommy said gleefully. And he lifted his foot and smashed it between David's legs. I could see the legs pop out of their sockets as he screamed. Tommy laughed so loud it almost drowned out David's cries. Then he let go of his legs and pulled him up by the neck, raising him into the air. Tommy's mouth opened about a foot wide, and his teeth grew long and pointed. Then he looked at me and wiggled his tongue like he was waving at me, and then he lunged his teeth into David's chest. Blood gushed out like a fountain. He looked at me again with his mouth full of bloody skin and broken bones. Then he spit it all out to the floor and plunged his mouth back and ate his heart. He looked almost aroused, stretching and moaning. And as he slung his head back in ecstasy and swallowed, the door opened slightly. So I pulled the door. This time it opened, and I grabbed Sid and ran to the house. Then Willie collapsed on the sofa. "There's nothing I could do," he cried. Codger sat next to him and put his hand on both his shoulders. "Of course not, my boy. You may have shared David's fate if you had tried. Then you wouldn't be able to give me this important information. So kudos to you, son." Willie wiped the tears from his eyes and asked the old man, "Who did you call, sir?" "A very old friend from my mystical days." Codger got up and walked to the back door. He drew the curtain a bit and looked outside. Then he raised his head and closed his eyes tightly. As Willie looked on, he began muttering again in broken English. It lasted just a couple of minutes. Then he opened his eyes and turned to Willie. "He's gone now." Willie asked him, "Where do you think he went?" He sighed and looked down. "I don't know, my boy. I'm afraid the people will be helpless against the scourge of the grizzly good." "The what?" he asked. "Let's get back upstairs." It was quiet as a tomb. Sid was sitting in the corner, his head bandaged, and obviously weak from the loss of blood. The girls were sitting around him with their eyes half closed. Codger grabbed a few crystals out of a drawer. "You kids should try and get some sleep. We should be safe for now." Still a bit dazed, they got up and walked towards Codger and followed him down the stairs. He led them to 2 bedrooms, one for the boys and one for the girls. On both doors, he hung the crystals, and the children, almost zombie-like, trudged through the doors and collapsed into a hard sleep. Codger then went back upstairs and opened a panel in the wall and pulled out an old hooded cloak. He held it in front of him. "It's been a while, old friend, but I'm afraid after all these years we have to hunt again." He then reached in and pulled out a haversack and set it next to the door. Then he heard the doorbell. It was about 2 in the morning, but he knew who it was. He grabbed the sack and cloak and went downstairs. He opened the door, and there stood a short, sightly having Creole woman carrying an old burlap tote bag. "Hello, Madame Philomene," he said. She just smiled and hugged him warmly. "Is this going to be like old times, Boo?" she said in a thick Haitian accent. He put his arms around her and led her inside. "Actually, my dear, it's going to be worse," he said. "We never faced anything like this before. We may not come out of it alive." "Well," she said, "at least it shouldn't be boring." "Now, Codger, one thing I have to know. Do you still make that Redolia Rosé tea? We might need a few gallons." He smiled, and they walked into the kitchen. While he was making tea, he told her of the night's happenings. "After my tea, I'll need to look around that shack," she said. "It's not a pretty sight, my dear. It's worse than the Loup-Garou attack in '49. "I can handle it, Boo. Don't you concern yourself with that." After they finished their tea, they went out to the shack. "Hold on a minute, Boo." She slung her sack off her shoulder and began to dig around in it. She pulled out a chicken foot charm and a vial of grave dirt and acacia. "Let's go, Boo." As they entered, the lamps were still on, lighting the entire horrific scene. "Ooh, mon ami, you may be right. It looks like we have a good on our hands. Bad, Jinxie." "I have to look at the poor boy," she said. "Wait here," Codric told her. He walked out the door, and a couple minutes later he came back with a plank of wood. "You shouldn't have wore those sandals, madam." He put the plank on the puddles of blood leading to David's body. "You're such a gentleman," she said. Then she noticed David's legs were pulled out of their sockets and blood seeping through the crotch of his pants. "Vile," she said. "Vile and needless. We have a spiteful good on our hands, mon ami." Then she reached into her sack and pulled out a cluster of bright feathers and began chanting in Haitian. As she waggled the feathers over David, after a couple of minutes she rose up. "This won't be comfy, sweetie. We're going to need some strong magic." "I know, my dear, but we have a little time. If I remember my Norse mythology, the grizzly good can only take over the body during the first crescent moon of the month. Tonight is the last night of the waning moon till the end of the month, and it doesn't have total control of Tommy yet, but it will when the second waning moon appears. Now it will lay low for a couple of weeks and slowly take over. We have to find him before that." "Is this Tommy boy a baddie?" she asked. "He was a study of Satanism, but all the time I spent with him and Sid, I always had the feeling he was on the fence, that inside he wasn't sure. It fled its last host after a car accident, and I believe it had to find another host before its present one got cold. And Tommy was the only one around that looked in its eyes, and that's how it got in. So he can put up a fight, but not for long. So the sooner we find him, the better," said Philomene. "Let's get some rest," said Codger. "Tomorrow we hit the books again."